Hey guys, tonight we tiptoe through gaslit streets, past fog-wreathed iron lampposts, into the drawing rooms of stiff-collared insomniacs sipping beef broth and silk pajamas. You won't believe the things Victorians tried to knock themselves out at night, and honestly, if you had to stomach warm mutton grease and mustard plasters to sleep, you'd probably opt for insomnia too. You're about to enter a world where sleeplessness isn't just a nuisance, it's a statement, a fashionable malady. And you probably won't survive this era with your appetite intact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And drop a comment with your location and local time. I always love seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You trudge through the chill haze of Victorian London, coat collar pulled up against the damp night. The streets shimmer beneath the golden glow of gaslights, an eerie beauty that signals not comfort but wakefulness. Because here in the drawing rooms and boudoirs behind these brick facades, the elite are wide awake. Not by choice necessarily, but certainly with flair. Insomnia has come into fashion. It's the 1840s. The industrial world is booming, clocks are everywhere, and your upstairs neighbor, the Viscount with the underbite and too many antique clocks, is on his 6th night without sleep. Naturally, he's composing long, tragic poetry about it. Everyone from poets to parliamentarians has declared sleeplessness a noble affliction, proof that one is sensitive, artistic, or simply too intelligent to rest. You pull back the velvet curtain and step into a parlor soaked in low candlelight and fretful sighs. There's Lady Bramblecroft, fanning herself in a corset that could fell a tree. She hasn't slept since Tuesday. What? Because she's reading too many serialized Gothic novels by candlelight. She blames the nervous energy in her blood, but frankly, it might just be the 17 cups of tea. Doctors at the time were, let's say, not especially helpful. The go-to diagnosis was nervous exhaustion, a deliciously vague term that applied to everything from a stubbed toe to existential dread. If you reported trouble sleeping, a Victorian physician might tell you to avoid overstimulation, and then prescribe you beef juice and red wine before bed. You know, to calm the blood. Here's where things get sticky, literally. One early insomnia remedy involved spreading a mustard plaster across your chest before bed. That's right, mustard. Not in a sandwich, on your skin. The idea was to draw heat and blood away from your brain, which Victorians believed was overheating from too much thinking. Too many feelings. Too much poetry. Historians still argue whether this idea came from ancient humoral medicine or was just a late-night dare gone medically rogue. Other recommendations included retiring at a consistent hour, which sounds reasonable until you remember that consistent meant after brandy and steak, not chamomile and journaling. In some households, people believed that eating heavy meat right before bed would weigh down your thoughts, like lead shot in a cannon, blasting you into unconsciousness. You'd be chewing roast lamb at 11:30 p.m. and calling it treatment. And it wasn't just the food. The furniture participated too. Your host's bedroom might be stuffed with overstuffed upholstery, blackout curtains of embroidered velvet, and a fireplace roaring beside the bed. A warm room was considered essential for the fragile nervous system. Which is strange, considering most Londoners of lower classes slept in cold, damp tenements and were out cold the minute their heads hit anything vaguely soft. Of course, if you were poor and couldn't sleep, the doctor didn't call it a nervous disorder. They called it laziness or moral failing. Funny how that works. Anyway, back in the bougie boudoirs, some of these restless aristocrats tried staying up all night to reset their system. Others took long, slow rides in horse-drawn carriages at 3 a.m., believing the gentle motion would lull them to sleep. That's right, you're bouncing down cobbled lanes under a fur blanket, half hoping a pothole knocks you unconscious. Just you, the coachman, and a flask of clove-infused brandy. It was all about routine. Or the performance of routine. You'd read the newspaper by gaslight, ignoring the part where flickering flame-lit light actually disrupted circadian rhythms, scribble your worries into a leather-bound journal, sip your weirdly beefy bedtime beverage, and then lie awake wondering why your head won't quiet down. The irony? This was also the century when public clocks became omnipresent. Railways required synchronized time. Factories demanded punctuality. Suddenly, everyone was obsessed with the hour. With measuring minutes. With noticing that it was now 2:37 a.m. and you were still wide-eyed, thinking about the meaning of mortality or the socks you wore last Tuesday. So naturally, sleeplessness started to seem like a consequence of civilization itself. If you were awake at night, maybe it meant you were modern, evolved, closer to genius. Or maybe just someone who ate mustard paste before bed and now couldn't stop hallucinating about dancing sheep. And speaking of hallucinations, that's another quirk from the period. Some insomniacs, desperate after days without real rest, reported vivid visions, angelic visitors, ghostly children, floating violins. One pamphlet from the era even describes a man who thought Queen Victoria herself appeared beside his bed to sing lullabies made of Latin grammar. A clear case of sleep deprivation, though frankly, the Queen did have a very rhythmic voice. You lie back in a feather-stuffed mattress that sinks like a Victorian soufflé, hands resting lightly on your wool blanket. You listen to the sounds of the house settling, the creak of oak floors, the moan of a drafty window. Somewhere a grandfather clock tolls the hour. Time keeps moving. But you don't. Not yet. Because next, you're about to descend into the cozy, terrifying world of liquid dreams, opium-laced syrups, and Victorian sleep potions that came with more poetry than warning labels. You settle into a velvet armchair so plush it swallows your spine, the fire crackling a little too enthusiastically nearby. A mahogany cabinet opens with a theatrical creak, revealing rows of delicate glass vials. Your host, an elegant gentleman with worry lines carved like etchings, selects one with practiced hands. Inside is a syrupy amber liquid, thick and glistening, dripping slowly from a silver spoon. Laudanum. A word that whispers like a lullaby and hits like a freight train. Welcome to the opium hourglass, where sleep doesn't come naturally but chemically. The Victorian solution to insomnia wasn't always rest. Sometimes it was surrender. Laudanum, that famous tincture of opium and alcohol, was the bedtime buddy of an entire anxious generation. It was cheaper than wine, more accessible than a priest, and wildly more effective than beef tea. You take your dose like everyone else, gripping the spoon, eyes half-lidded, as it pools onto your tongue with a strangely floral bitterness. It tastes like dried poppies and regret. By the 1850s, nearly every British apothecary had their own branded version of laudanum. You could find it shelved between digestive tonics and something called Mother's Quiet Cordial, which you correctly assume was code for narcotic pacifier. It was prescribed for everything from coughs and colic to heartbreak and sleepless anguish. And let's be honest, you don't get packaging that poetic anymore. The advertisements were masterclasses in euphemism. One ad claimed laudanum restores the soul to its natural stillness, which sounds lovely until you remember the soul is not supposed to slur its words and forget its own name. Doctors doled it out liberally and most patients didn't ask questions. Why would they? There were no warning labels, no dosage charts. Just intuition, a teaspoon, and maybe a vague warning to use judiciously if one's constitution allows. Which is Victorian for we're not liable. Of course it wasn't just doctors. Even poets got involved. Samuel Taylor Coleridge famously composed Kubla Khan in an opium haze, and Thomas de Quincey wrote his dreamy, sometimes disturbing confessions of an English opium eater as both a warning and a love letter to the stuff. These weren't cautionary tales. They were bedtime stories for grown-ups who wanted their rest as dramatic as their lives. You recline deeper into your chair, feeling a heat crawl through your limbs, not unpleasant, just slow. That was the draw. Opium didn't knock you out with a thud. It wound the world down like a music box losing its spring. Thoughts melted. Muscles softened. If you were lucky, you floated into dreams full of cloudy figures and velvet skies. But not everyone was lucky. Historians still argue whether laudanum addiction was epidemic level or just conveniently ignored, especially among women. Victorian housewives, especially the bored or bereaved, were heavy consumers. The term opium habit became a polite way of saying someone was slowly unraveling in floral wallpapered silence. Clergy weren't silent about it though. In sermons they railed against the moral stupor infecting the nation's bedrooms. They insisted that true rest came from prayer, not poppy juice. You imagine some poor vicar shaking his Bible at a widow who just needed 5 hours of uninterrupted sleep and a break from her 11 children. Ironically, many churchgoers took opium tinctures themselves, quietly, guiltily, between hymns. Because let's face it, when the choices are eternal damnation or 8 hours of sleep, a lot of folks choose a nap and risk the consequences later. But the real twist? Victorians didn't always think of laudanum as a bad habit. For decades, it was considered sophisticated. Even chic. You weren't a dangerous addict. You were a sensitive soul with a delicate constitution. And in a time when emotions weren't always allowed, the bottle was a socially acceptable way to dull everything down to a faint hum. Even children weren't spared. Mothers gave laudanum-laced syrups to infants as sleep aids. One infamous product, Godfrey's Cordial, was used so frequently among working-class families that newspapers started quietly referring to it as the baby killer. But no laws were passed. No regulations enforced. It was a silent epidemic, lethal, yes, but soothing. Not everyone was buying it, though, literally or metaphorically. Some doctors, ahead of their time, began speaking out. They noticed patients who began with night doses for insomnia but soon needed a hit every few hours just to function. One particularly grim case from 1874 describes a barrister who started sleeping better, and then gradually stopped doing anything else. He was eventually found in his study, eyes open, heart slowed to a polite murmur, laudanum bottle clutched like a crucifix. Still, even as criticism grew, the Victorian attachment to opium endured. There was a belief, almost mystical, that sleep should be earned through suffering and then rewarded with a potion. Something earned, something paid for. And laudanum became the coin. You might wonder, was it worth it? Hard to say. Even now, historians don't agree on the scope of the problem. Some say it was exaggerated by moralists. Others argue it was swept under the rug by polite society. But one thing's certain, as the 19th century wore on, sleep became less a natural rhythm and more a chemical transaction. And somewhere in all that amber darkness, you're still sitting in that armchair, watching another spoonful drip, the hourglass grain by grain, into the quiet throat of night. You hear the faint clink of glass on wood. A sleepy sigh from the next room. The fire hisses as it settles. And just before your eyelids fall, you catch the next strange scent in the air, brass, wood polish, and something electric. Because next, you're about to meet the sleep machines. The ticking, humming contraptions designed to hypnotize, shock, or just plain confuse you into slumber. You're lying on a contraption that feels like a rejected prototype from a steampunk inventor's fever dream. The mattress creaks beneath you, not from age but from gears. Yes, actual gears. Somewhere beneath the lace coverlet, a tiny engine ticks to life. The software. A faint vibration. You've just activated your somnambulatory sleep-inducing cot, one of many bewildering inventions that promise to tame the beast of Victorian insomnia through pure, unapologetic machinery. Because if meat plasters and laudanum didn't do the trick, maybe brass would. It's the late 19th century, and the Victorian obsession with sleep has turned mechanical. You're now entering an era where people genuinely believed they could engineer their way into dreams. Like slumber was a broken faucet just waiting to be tightened with the right spanner. The invention craze was very real. Spurred on by the Industrial Revolution and a healthy dose of hubris, tinkerers and gentlemen scientists flooded the patent offices with all manner of sleep devices. The goal? Reboot the human brain using cogs, cranks, magnets, and wires. You know, the usual cozy stuff. One popular invention was the hypnotic chair, a spindly wooden throne equipped with a slowly rotating spiral disc mounted at eye level. You'd be instructed to fixate on the spinning spiral while a sleep practitioner whispered monotone affirmations about how tired you felt. Think of it as hypnosis meets IKEA with a dash of seance. The longer you watched, the heavier your eyelids became, until, in theory, you slipped into unconsciousness. In practice, you probably just got dizzy and moderately insulted. Then there was the electromagnetic slumber helmet, which sounds like something a supervillain would wear but was actually sold as a cure for neurasthenic exhaustion. The Victorian catch-all for any discomfort that couldn't be blamed on spirits or syphilis. It consisted of a tightly fitted brass or copper band, sometimes with magnets woven into the lining. You'd wear it to bed, convinced that its weak electrical currents would calm cerebral vibrations. Let that sink in. The plan was to electrocute your forehead, gently. Historians still argue whether these machines were born from legitimate curiosity or sheer desperation. Most likely both. After all, the Victorians had no shortage of confidence in the machine age. If a loom could weave 1,000 yards of silk an hour, surely some gears could lull you to sleep, right? You shift slightly on your current mechanical bed. A gear clicks beneath your shoulder blade. Somewhere, a tiny pendulum swings back and forth, mimicking a heartbeat you no longer trust. This was one of many beds designed to rock you subtly, like a mechanical cradle. Patents describe them as automatic oscillation platforms and sleep inducement couches. You think they feel more like lying on a possessed metronome, and yet people swore by them. Some wealthy Victorians even commissioned custom sleep chambers, complete with timed gaslight dimmers, wind-up lullaby music boxes, and pressurized oxygen delivery. Yes, they tried turning sleep into an actual science experiment. One recorded case involves a viscount who had a brass-framed bed suspended from the ceiling by chains, gently swinging all night like an iron hammock. It was said to reduce nightly disturbances caused by the vibrations of streetcar horses. Or maybe it just made him feel like a chandelier. But the piece de resistance of this era had to be the ether ventilator. This dubious masterpiece involved a bedside funnel connected to a bellows, which sprayed a controlled mist of ether, a mild anesthetic, into your face as you drifted off. It was the Victorian equivalent of knocking yourself out with designer gas. Hospitals used ether to numb patients during amputations, so naturally someone thought, what if we used it recreationally but with a fancier nozzle? You lie still, pretending not to notice that this entire room smells like a science fair accident. Despite how eccentric it all sounds, there was a serious philosophy behind these machines. Victorians believed that sleep had become unnatural. The world had grown too loud, too fast. Trains roared through cities. Factories pounded the ground day and night. Gaslights extended the waking hours past what bodies could bear. So they concluded maybe the solution wasn't to rest more, but to design better tools for surrender. One such tool was the mechanical dream recorder, a fringe device that supposedly captured brainwaves during sleep using metal coils and paper scrolls. Think EEG meets Ouija board. No one really knows if it ever worked. Probably not. But people were desperate enough to try anything that promised a glimpse into their midnight minds. It wasn't just the gadgets that grew elaborate, rituals did too. Some insomniacs orchestrated full symphonies of sensory control. Timed meal intakes, measured baths, scented oils, and bed platforms calibrated to tilt ever so slightly toward magnetic north. It was like trying to fall asleep in a planetarium designed by Tesla. Of course, some folks went full rogue. One particularly ambitious Yorkshire doctor created a pneumatic sleep pod, a sealed iron tube that regulated airflow and mimicked high-altitude pressure. He claimed it pressed fatigue out of the spine. Most people just said it looked like a coffin with upholstery. But again, some of these contraptions helped people sleep, or at least gave them a sense of control. And in a world where medicine was often a guessing game and spiritualists offered dreams and crystal balls, a brass and gear solution seemed refreshingly logical. You lie back as your bed gives a final sympathetic creak. The gears spin down. The hypnotic pulse fades. And even though your body doesn't quite trust this thing not to collapse, your mind has grown quieter. You've surrendered in a way, if not to sleep, then at least to its strange pursuit. In the room next door, a lady gently oils her copper forehead band while reciting her nightly affirmations. Outside, a lamplighter taps the cobblestone with his stick. Somewhere upstairs, someone adjusts their ether funnel and exhales a sleepy giggle. The machines may have failed to deliver on their promises, but they left a legacy, a steely, humming, gear-spun hope that maybe rest could be designed. But next, you'll meet the people who gave up on machines entirely and instead placed their faith in something far older, a ghostly blend of astrology, spiritualism, and Victorian moonbathing. Because when the brass broke down, the stars were still there. You sit with both hands wrapped around a delicate porcelain teacup, its floral design fading from too many steeps of strange herbal concoctions. Tonight's brew? Boiled lettuce water. Yes, actual lettuce soaked, simmered, and strained into what smells like salad broth. You take a cautious sip. It's warm. Slightly metallic. Slightly offensive. But if the Victorians swore it could summon sleep, who are you to argue? This was the age of homegrown hope and pseudoscientific remedies, when your pantry doubled as a pharmacy, and the boundary between soothing and electrocution was blurry at best. Lettuce, for instance, wasn't just food, it was medicine. Victorians believed it had mild sedative powers, owing to a milky sap called lacticarium found in the stems of certain varieties. Apothecaries sold it bottled. Housewives brewed it in kettles. Some even made lettuce wine, because nothing says bedtime like a fermented Caesar salad. This was part of a wider, natural cure movement sweeping through parlors and drawing rooms. People were starting to distrust the pills and potions lining apothecary shelves, especially after the opium backlash. If laudanum could rot your brain and hypnotic machines could jam your spine, then maybe a gentle garden tea was the safer gamble. So you tried warm milk with nutmeg or vinegar foot rubs or placing onions on your chest. No, really. It was believed the fumes loosened nervous tension. You probably just cried yourself to sleep. At the more respectable end of things, you had herbalists, part botanist, part philosopher, who peddled sleep as a lifestyle. They encouraged moonlit walks, quiet journaling, and chamomile compresses on the temples. Their cabinets brimmed with poppy petals, passionflower, hops, and skullcap, plants with just enough effect to make you feel like something was happening, even if it wasn't. But of course, this is still Victorian England. And Victorians never met a treatment they couldn't complicate. Enter the electric bath. You undress slowly, modestly of course, and step into a deep porcelain tub filled with warm water. Electrodes are placed at either end. Wires snake along the tile. A flick of a switch and a faint tingle dances across the surface. Not enough to hurt. Just enough to make your molars hum. Welcome to hydroelectric therapy. It was sold as revolutionary, a merging of two life forces, water and electricity. Medical spas from London to Leeds installed full bathing suites where patients could soak in current, letting the gentle buzz stimulate their nerves into restful compliance. The belief was that insomnia was a dysfunction of nervous energy, and electricity, when carefully applied, could rebalance your system. Some physicians swore by it. Others called it quackery with a splash of showmanship. Historians still argue whether these baths did anything meaningful, or if people simply fell asleep afterward from sheer overstimulation. And yes, sometimes the voltage got a little enthusiastic. One account describes a woman who briefly lost the power of her left toe after a session. Another man said it felt like being massaged by bees. But the trend stuck around long enough for electricity to become synonymous with vitality, and many assumed that whatever energized the body could also quiet it, once properly discharged. Not to be outdone, another movement emerged around color bathing, where sleep seekers were encouraged to bathe beneath colored glass to absorb the restful hues. Blue was for calm, green for harmony, red was inexplicably for digestive ease. You lie in your bath, windows tinted with cobalt panes, trying not to overthink the fact that your entire body now resembles a moody jellyfish. Meanwhile, the vegetarian health resorts in places like Surrey offered carrot elixirs, cold compresses, and sun-drenched naps on barley-stuffed cushions. They rejected meat, drugs, and machines in favor of pure living, which usually meant waking up at dawn, avoiding coffee, and bathing in ice-cold rivers. Imagine being told the solution to sleeplessness was to freeze your body and avoid tea. No wonder some people preferred the electroshocks. You're starting to notice a pattern here. For every scientific-sounding breakthrough, electricity, magnets, gears, there was a pastoral counterweight. Roots, herbs, water, silence. The Victorian age teetered between over-engineering and over-romanticizing. One foot in the laboratory, the other barefoot in a dewy meadow. In the middle of this strange tug-of-war were the wellness guides and sleep evangelists who published long treatises with titles like The Natural Repose, On Rest and Its Philosophical Attainment, or The Midnight Brainstorm, Calming the Churn Within. These books were part advice, part poetry, part long-winded rant against the industrial age. They scolded people for late-night reading, warned of overthinking before bed, and advocated for deep abdominal breathing, a concept now found in every modern yoga app. Quirky tip? One popular suggestion: counting chimney swifts instead of sheep, because according to one widely read pamphlet, their irregular patterns lull the eye into compliant stillness. Yes, that's how far people were reaching for rest. And lest we forget the sleep stones, little pouches of amethyst or rose quartz, believed to emit calming vibrations. You'd place them under your pillow and hope the mineral magic would do what morphine could not. Whether it helped or not, the placebo effect likely worked its gentle magic. After all, belief is half the cure. By the late 1800s, you had choices. You could sedate yourself with lettuce water. You could shock yourself in a spa tub. You could nap in a sunbeam while clutching a warm, lavender-stuffed satchel. None of these things guaranteed results, but they provided rituals. And sometimes, rituals are what insomnia fears most. You slide a little deeper into your now-cooled bath, wondering if the slight buzz in your fingertips is therapeutic or just faulty wiring. A candle flickers. Somewhere down the street, a dog barks once and then gives up. The air smells faintly of thyme and ozone. In another house, someone is eating a spoonful of cold mashed peas to lull themselves into slumber. Across town, an elderly man rocks himself in a creaky chair draped in copper mesh. And in the next section, we drift even further into the uncanny, where Victorians no longer look outward for sleep cures but inward, into the subconscious, into dreams, into seance circles and moonlit trance rituals. The garden is closed. The wires are silent. Now you're about to dream the Victorian way. You're standing in the thick velvet shadow of a London townhouse, its upper windows glowing gold against the starless sky. Inside, gaslights flicker low, silk dressing gowns rustle, and something sizzling in the kitchen smells suspiciously like midnight beef. Welcome to the private world of the sleepless elite, where insomnia isn't just endured, it's indulged. You wander barefoot across a Persian rug into the drawing room, where an overstuffed armchair waits for you. On the nearby table lies an insomniac's survival kit. No, not melatonin gummies and a weighted blanket, but a curious Victorian spread of beefsteak, port wine, foxglove tincture, a tin of anchovy paste, and a slim volume of poetry by Tennyson, open to a particularly droning stanza. Let's begin with the beef. Rich Victorians, especially men, genuinely believed that heavy, hot food at night could anchor the nerves. The science, of course, was dubious at best. Eating a pound of meat before bed probably leads to more vivid dreams about chasing wild pigs than true REM sleep. But for some, it worked, especially if it was washed down with port. Port wine, that syrupy fortress of sugar and alcohol, was the gentleman's answer to chamomile tea. It was believed to fortify the blood and calm the inner tumult. Doctors didn't entirely object. They often prescribed alcohol in moderation to weaken the wakefulness, particularly for women suffering from what was then daintily termed nervous excitability. And yet, nestled in all this decadence was danger. Take foxglove, for instance. The same plant that produces digitalis, a potent heart medicine, was occasionally used in small tinctures to slow the pulse and lull the mind. Too much and your heart stops. But the Victorian elite flirted with such edges often. Sleep was precious, and if taming the mind required sipping something brewed from a toxic flower, so be it. Historians still argue whether these choices were based more on science or on class performance. After all, a poor laborer suffering insomnia might get a crust of bread and a cold floor. But a baronet? He could afford a footman to fetch stewed kidneys and laudanum, and someone to read Paradise Lost aloud until his eyeballs gave out. Indeed, one of the most bizarre and strangely charming upper-class sleep rituals was the poetry reading for one. Imagine your valet standing nearby with a wax-sealed book, gently reciting lines from Wordsworth in a monotone whisper while you lie in bed, half dreaming, half sulking, entirely unimpressed. One diarist wrote that her husband succumbed to sleep midway through stanza 8 of a particularly tedious ode to windmills. Your cat would have left the room. Then there were the tools, literal objects kept on hand to assist with the long hours of not sleeping. These might include a tiny vial of smelling salts, to revive flagging focus, if the poetry got too drowsy, a monogrammed snuff box, or even a leather-bound journal in which to jot midnight reflections like, "Still awake. Must remember to scold the cook. Dreams elusive." A quirky but genuine item found in many nightstands was the sleeping cap soaked in violet water. The Victorians believed scent played a vital role in sleep hygiene, and wealthy households often dripped essential oils onto their nightwear. Violet, lavender, and bergamot were favorites. Some would even perfume their pillowcases or hire a night maid to air the linens with rosewater. The rooms themselves became theatrical stages for sleep's hopeful arrival. Heavy curtains shut out the moon. Thick carpets muffled every creak. Grand fireplaces glowed low with embers, and ticking mantel clocks echoed like a heartbeat. In one famously fussy household, the bed was positioned facing magnetic north to align the soul's compass. And if sleep still wouldn't come? Well, there were always night carriages. Picture this, it's 3 a.m. You step into your private carriage, draped with thick furs, windows fogged from breath and whiskey, and direct your coachman to drive aimlessly. The rhythmic clatter of hooves, the swaying of the wheels, and the cool air through a cracked pane were considered nature's own lullaby. This wasn't as uncommon as you might think. Letters from the era speak of sleep rides through the countryside, where wealthy insomniacs hoped motion could do what medicine could not. Not to be left behind, aristocratic women developed their own rituals, many of them delicate, drawn-out performances. A typical evening toilette might take over an hour, involving cool milk baths, hair brushing, exactly 100 strokes naturally, a drop of clove oil behind each ear, and a silent prayer said while kneeling on a tufted cushion. For some, a bit of morphine-laced cough syrup was the final step. For others, it was simply slipping into fresh linen and letting the maids draw the canopy curtains shut with a soft swish. One rather peculiar method, documented in the journal of Lady Horatia Bellwether, involved wearing a metal circlet around the temples, a sort of DIY halo she claimed redirected cerebral lightning. The science on cerebral lightning is, shall we say, sketchy. But the elite were often more interested in innovation than efficacy. Even pets weren't spared. Fancy pugs and spaniels were known to receive their own tinctures and velvet-lined beds near the hearth, lest their whining disturbed their owner's delicate descent into slumber. Of course, all this finery didn't always work. For many aristocrats, insomnia remained a cruel paradox, surrounded by comfort, swaddled in luxury, but mentally buzzing with unspent thoughts. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps digestion, or maybe, just maybe, some part of them feared what sleep might bring, dreams of debt, disinheritance, or a damp English fox hunt that ended badly. And as the candles gutter low and the beef cools on your silver plate, you wonder, was all this pomp really about sleep, or about controlling sleep? Taming it, making it obey. Victorians did love a good conquest after all. You shift in your chair and glance toward the lace-curtained window. Somewhere out there, a simpler soul is already snoring beneath patchwork quilts. No tinctures. No foxglove. No poetry readings. Just breath and time. But here in the city's high towers and hushed halls, the war against wakefulness continues with silver cutlery and perfumed linen. Still, not even the richest duchess can keep the dawn at bay. And next, you'll peer behind the curtain where the truly odd things happened. Where Victorians turned not to beef or brass or botanicals, but to the strange and shimmering realm of dreams. Where spiritualists, mesmerists, and candlelit seances promised the ultimate cure for insomnia, surrender. And so, you drift a little further forward, out of the echoing corridors of gaslit London, through the soot and sigh of a restless empire, into the edge of a new century where electric bulbs now buzz faintly overhead and pocket watches tick more precisely than ever. Your slippers scuff the polished wood floor of a turn-of-the-century sleep clinic. It's clinical now, less midnight beefsteak and more lab coats and clipboards. The velvet has been replaced with stark linens. The tinctures? Rebranded as nervine tonics, and tucked into respectable glass bottles labeled patent pending. You settle onto a narrow hospital bed under the watchful eye of a young doctor who scribbles something in his notebook while checking the mechanism of a primitive EEG machine. The year is 1901, and the hunt for real sleep science has begun. But something nags at you. After everything the Victorians tried, opium, lettuce water, magnetic mattresses, meat feasts, spiritual rituals, did anything actually work? Historians still argue whether the Victorians ever really slept at all. Or were they, as one scholar put it, simply ritualizing the restlessness? Layering sleeplessness with ceremony, distraction, and drama until it felt meaningful, maybe even noble. At the start of the 20th century, insomnia was being repackaged. Instead of being framed as a moral failure or spiritual imbalance, it was slowly becoming a medical condition, with measurable symptoms and emerging treatments. Doctors began to map sleep disturbances as part of nervous disorders, tying them to things like neurasthenia, an extremely Victorian diagnosis for when the soul simply fizzled. There was progress. Some of the more outlandish treatments were quietly phased out. No more foxglove on toast. Less mustard plasters. Laudanum prescriptions were increasingly frowned upon as regulators finally realized that routinely sedating the nation with liquid opium wasn't exactly sustainable public health policy. But not everything was discarded. Take valerian root, for example, that earthy, cabbage-scented herb your great-aunt might swear by. It was used by the Victorians, and it's still sold today in modern pharmacies under the label Natural Sleep Aid. The same with lavender, which shows up now in fancy pillow sprays and bath bombs. You've probably used one, smelled one, maybe even fallen asleep with one. Meanwhile, spiritualism, though it fizzled in the mainstream, did leave echoes. The idea that sleep was a liminal space, a threshold, lingered. People were still fascinated by dreams, and some doctors cautiously explored dream journaling and lucid dreaming as possible pathways to better sleep hygiene. Yes, even Freud got in on the action. His interpretation of dreams hit shelves in 1899, and suddenly everyone's insomnia had meaning. But not everyone embraced science. The Victorian obsession with sleep lived on in quieter ways, handed down like bedtime folklore. Families clung to passed-down rituals: warm milk with honey, reading until your eyes blur, whispering a prayer, opening a window just slightly. You probably know someone who still swears by these. Maybe it's you. And modern sleep medicine? Well, it now boasts fancy acronyms: CBTI, Cognitive Behavioral Therapy for Insomnia, CPAP machines, melatonin cycles, blue light blockers. But would any of this impress a 19th century insomniac who once had his valet recite Wordsworth while his chambermaid sprinkled rosewater on the pillow? You stretch your limbs across the narrow bed and smile. Because even now, after all the studies and statistics, a strange truth remains. No one really knows why we sleep, or what truly makes it happen. Scientists can track brainwaves. They can scan your REM cycles. But the moment sleep arrives, that mysterious slip into unconsciousness, is still a whisper in the dark. And so, maybe the Victorians weren't so ridiculous after all. They tried everything because sleep was a mystery, a holy grail, a nightly resurrection. They feared it, adored it, sought it out with equal parts desperation and drama. And maybe, in some candlelit bedroom in Bath or a dusty townhouse in Edinburgh, someone did finally find peace. Not from a tonic. Not from a poem, but from surrender. Because that's the secret, isn't it? Sleep doesn't like to be chased. It shows up when you stop running. When you let go. When the fan hums low and the night air brushes your cheek and you're finally tired of thinking. Maybe that's what the Victorians missed. Somewhere between the opium and the gadgets and the foxglove tea. The act of not trying. Now your eyelids are heavy. You can hear the faint tick of a clock. Feel the imagined weight of a warm quilt across your chest. In some alternate London, the carriages have stopped. The gas lights are out. Even the Duchess has stopped her poetry reading. You roll onto your side and murmur a sleepy thought. Perhaps sleep has always been more about trust than treatment. And you, dear listener, are already halfway there. So now let it all slow down. Let the last brass contraption fade into the shadows, and the velvet curtains fall shut. Let the quiet of a world chasing dreams drift gently past you like mist over cobblestones. You've wandered through the rituals, the remedies, the restless minds who dared to tame the night, and now it's your turn to do absolutely nothing. There's no poem left to read, no tincture to swallow, no creaking bed frame begging for a patent. Just your breath, soft and slow, stretching long and quiet into the dark. Feel the hush settle into your muscles, warm and weightless, like sleep itself is wrapping around you like an old familiar shawl. And if your mind stirs, if it flickers back to beefsteaks or foxglove, just smile at the absurdity and let the thought go. Sleep is already here.